Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on a really fascinating, but also pretty disturbing case. The story of Robert Nixon, an American serial killer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and we've got some excerpts from a Wikipedia article about him.
Okay.
And we're going to see how his story kind of gets into these big issues, like racial injustice and how much influence the media has.
Right.
Oh, and get this, there's a connection to like a super famous piece of American literature, too.
Really?
Yeah, so buckle up, guys. This one is going to be crazy.
Well, what I think is so interesting about this case is that it's not just like a bunch of awful crimes, right?
Yeah.
Robert Nixon's life and how people talked about his story, it really shows us a lot about some really deep societal problems back then.
Okay, so let's just start with the basics. Like, who was this Robert Nixon?
So Robert Nixon was born in 1919 in Tallulah, Louisiana,
Okay.
and he was executed in Chicago in 1939 when he was only 19 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, in that short time, he confessed to 5 murders and a whole bunch of assaults.
Oh my God.
And that's actually how he got the nickname, the Brick Moron,
Oh, wow.
because of what he used as a weapon and also how the media portrayed him.
The Brick Moron, it's like a scary nickname, but it shows how much this case caught everyone's attention.
Yeah.
But before we get into all that, let's talk about the crimes themselves. What do we actually know?
Okay, so the things that really made Robert Nixon infamous all started in 1937 in Los Angeles with these, what were called the Brick Bat murders.
Okay.
These murders were really brutal, and they seemed so random it really scared people.
So, like, walk me through what happened.
So the first victims were this 8-year-old woman, Edna Worden, and her 12-year-old daughter, Marguerite.
Oh, gosh.
They were found murdered in their apartment. Both of them had been sexually assaulted and then bludgeoned to death with a brick.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, and then the LAPD linked those murders to another similar killing, 20-year-old Rose Valdez.
Jeez.
She was murdered in her own home while her baby was sleeping in the next room. Thankfully, the baby wasn't hurt.
That is just horrifying.
Yeah.
A killer on the loose randomly attacking families in their homes? I mean, everyone in LA must have been terrified.
Absolutely.
Was Robert Nixon a suspect at this point?
Not yet. At that point, Nixon wasn't even on the police radar.
Really?
Yeah, but the investigators were looking for someone connected to a bunch of brutal assaults that were happening around the same time.
Okay.
So one attack happened at Montesano Hospital. This guy, H.W. Cole, was attacked. And then Elizabeth Damrell was attacked in her own home.
Wow.
And in both cases, the attacker was described as an African-American man, and he used a brick as a weapon.
So brick attacks again.
Exactly. And this is creepy witnesses said they saw a man who looked like the attacker hanging around Rose Valdez's place as before she was murdered.
Oh, wow. So we've got these awful attacks and murders in LA, but still no clear connection to Robert Nixon.
Right.
So how does he finally become part of the story?
Okay, so now the story moves to Chicago in 1938. And this woman, Florence Johnson, the wife of a Chicago fireman, was murdered during a burglary.
Oh, no.
And guess what the murder weapon was?
A brick. Wow, this pattern of brick attacks is just continuing.
Yeah, it is.
So how did they arrest Nixon for this one?
So Nixon was arrested just a few hours after Florence Johnson's murder. The police saw blood on his clothes, and he had scratches on his hand.
Oh.
So right away, he was the main suspect.
Yeah.
And it turns out he wasn't alone during this burglary. He had an accomplice, a 19-year-old guy named Earl Hicks.
Okay, so now we've got an accomplice. That makes things a lot more complicated.
It does.
So what happened next? Did Nixon confess?
He did. He confessed to killing Florence Johnson, but right away he tried to blame Hicks for it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he said it was Hicks who actually hit her and killed her.
Okay.
But then Hicks said that Nixon only attacked her after she woke up and started screaming during the burglary.
So it's a classic he said, she said situation.
Totally.
But I bet there's more to this story, right? You mentioned something about a connection to a famous book earlier. Is that where this is going?
You're exactly right. And this is where things get really interesting because, you see, while he was in jail, Nixon didn't just confess to killing Florence Johnson. He also confessed to another murder that happened back in 1936.
What?
The killing of Florence Thompson Castle, a nightclub hostess.
Whoa, hold on, another murder, another victim who was this woman.
So Florence Thompson Castle was murdered in her hotel room, which she shared with her 7-year-old son.
Oh my God.
And to make it even creepier, Nixon had written these words on her mirror in lipstick, Black Legion game.
Black Legion. Wasn't that like a white supremacist group?
It was, yeah.
Was this a hate crime? Was the Black Legion really involved?
That's what Nixon wanted the police to think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it seems like writing Black Legion game was totally on purpose, like he was trying to trick the police and lead them in the wrong direction.
So it was a distraction.
Exactly. And, I mean, the Black Legion did exist, and they were known for being violent and hateful, but there's no proof they were actually part of this murder.
So it was basically a fake clue?
Right? But even though it was a clever trick, it didn't work in the end, did it?
Yeah, I guess not.
Remember how the police found blood and scratches on Nixon after Florence Johnson's murder?
Yeah.
Well, they already had his fingerprints from when he was arrested before, and those fingerprints matched the ones they found at Florence Castle's murder scene.
Oh, wow.
So when they showed him this evidence, Nixon admitted to writing that message on the mirror.
Okay, so now we have confessions and fingerprints connecting Nixon to 2 murders in Chicago.
Right.
But what about those murders in L.A.? Were they ever linked to him?
They were. When the LAPD heard about the brick moron being arrested in Chicago, they sent fingerprint evidence from that warden department to Chicago.
Okay.
And guess what?
What?
The fingerprints on a milk bottle in the warden's apartment matched Robert Nixon's.
Wow, that's a huge break in the case. It seems like they had so much evidence against him by then.
They did.
So what did Nixon say when they showed him this new evidence?
Faced with that fingerprint evidence, Nixon confessed to killing Edna and Marguerite Worden.
What?
And to make this whole thing even more sensational, the police decided to take him back to the scene of Florence Castle's murder at the Devonshire Hotel for like a dramatic reenactment.
Hold on, a reenactment? That seems really strange even for back then. What was the point of that?
Well, remember, this case was already all over the news. People were obsessed with it and horrified by it, and the media was going crazy.
Right.
The reenactment with Nixon acting out the murder in front of a bunch of people just made it even more of a frenzy.
Yeah. I can only imagine there must have been a huge crowd, a lot of anger, especially since the crime was so awful. What was it like during that reenactment?
It was chaotic. There's this giant crowd outside the hotel, tons of people yelling that they should lynch Nixon.
Oh, my God.
The police had to hold back the mob, while Nixon, surrounded by reporters and photographers, pretended to do the murder again.
Wow, that's just an insane image. A young guy accused of these terrible killings, reenacting them in front of a mob that wants him dead.
I know.
It really showed how intensely people felt about this case, and I'm sure how the racial tension just made it worse.
You're absolutely right. This case wasn't just about the crimes. It became this big symbol of the racial problems and prejudices that were happening back then.
You were saying how Robert Nixon's case got all mixed up with the racial problems of that time.
It did, yeah.
So how did that affect how the case was handled and how the news reported on it?
Well, you got to remember, this is the 1930s.
Right.
Like, racial prejudice and segregation were just a normal part of America back then.
Yeah.
And all of that really affected how people saw Robert Nixon, both the public and the justice system.
So how did those prejudices, change the story around Robert Nixon and his crimes?
The media, especially the white newspaper, they were a big part of shaping how the public saw Robert Nixon.
Okay.
They used this language that made him seem less than human, like he was some kind of monster.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they called him slow-witted, a colored moron. They just kept using that nickname, the brick moron, over and over again.
It's like they were trying to make him fit this image that people already had in their minds.
Exactly.
And I bet all that biased reporting just made the fear and prejudice around the case even worse.
It definitely did this kind of language. It wasn't just about reporting the facts. It was about feeding into these racist stereotypes and fears that were already there.
Yeah.
There's one article that's a really bad example of this. It was in the Chicago Tribune in June 1938.
What was so bad about that article?
It was called Brick Slayer is Likened to Jungle Beast.
Oh my gosh.
And in the article, this reporter, Charles Leaville, used some seriously racist language comparing Nixon to an ape and the missing link.
Wow.
This kind of stuff wasn't that unusual back then, but it just shows how normal those racist ideas were.
It's crazy to think that these stereotypes were just accepted like that. Even in the news, it makes you wonder if some of that bias is still around today, even if it's not as obvious.
Yeah, you're right. We like to think we've come a long way since the 1930s. But the truth is, these biases are still out there and they can be hard to see.
It's true.
It's something we always need to be thinking about, especially when we see how the media talks about crime and criminals.
Definitely, we all have to be careful about the information we see, especially when it comes to race and justice.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned before that there was another perspective on the case from an African-American newspaper called the Chicago Defender.
Right.
So how was their coverage different from the mainstream white press?
The Chicago Defender was way more critical of the whole investigation and how they were portraying Nixon.
Okay.
They questioned whether his confessions were even real. They would even put the word confession in quotation marks to suggest that maybe he was forced to confess.
Huh, interesting.
They also talked about how the white press was making the story super sensational and inflammatory, and they said there was definitely racial bias in the investigation.
That's a really good point. It's so important to have different perspectives on a case like this, especially when you think about who has the power.
Exactly.
Having a newspaper that was specifically for the African-American community meant that a different story could be told.
Right.
One that challenged the main story that was often racist that was coming from the mainstream media.
Yeah. And The Chicago Defender's coverage made people consider other possibilities, like maybe Nixon wasn't the monster the white press was making him out to be.
Right.
And maybe racial prejudice was affecting the investigation and how the media was talking about it.
It's true.
It shows how important it is to have different voices in the media and how they can challenge what's normal and help us understand complicated events in a better way.
Absolutely. So we have these two very different ways of looking at Robert Nixon and the crimes he was accused of.
Yeah,
One saying he was a savage beast, and the other questioning if the confessions were even real and if the investigation was fair.
exactly.
It's like there were two different cases happening at the same time in the public's mind.
And that's what makes this case so interesting and still important today.
Yeah.
It forces us to think about how much power the media has to tell stories, how racial bias is still a problem, and how complicated the criminal justice system is.
Okay, so before we get into the trial and what happened in the end, let's talk about the victims for a second.
Sure.
You said the media was really biased and unfair to Robert Nixon.
Yeah.
Did they cover the victims any differently?
Yes. Definitely. The coverage of the victims, especially the white victims, was totally different.
How so?
They would write about them in a way that made people feel sorry for them. They would talk about how innocent and vulnerable they were.
Okay.
Like with Florence Johnson, they kept talking about how she was a mother and a wife, and they would even show pictures of her kids to make the public feel sympathy for her.
That's so sad, but I guess I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
It feels like they were trying to make Nixon look even worse while making the victims seem more human in a way that just reinforced the racial divisions that already existed.
You're right. This kind of coverage was everywhere back then.
Yeah.
It played into those existing racial prejudices and helped create this image of this dangerous black man who's preying on innocent white people.
And I bet that kind of story had real consequences.
It definitely did. It made people more scared of and angry at the black community, and it contributed to things like white people moving out of neighborhoods where black people were moving in, and it made segregation even worse.
It's a reminder of how the media can be used to manipulate what people think and to keep those in power, even if it hurts marginalized communities.
Absolutely. The Robert Nixon case is a perfect example of how media stories, especially when they're full of racial bias, can have a huge impact on how we understand crime justice and each other.
Okay, so we've got these two totally different ways of portraying Robert Nixon and the crimes he was accused of.
Right.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Nixon had this accomplice named Earl Hicks.
I did, yeah.
What happened to him? Like, how did his case turn out compared to Nixon's?
So they ended up taking Earl Hicks to Los Angeles to the Warden apartment.
Okay.
And he admitted to hitting young Marguerite Warden with a pistol, but he said he never sexually assaulted anyone or used a brick.
Huh.
He also confessed to attacking Zoe Damerel and taking money from the warden's place.
So he wasn't exactly innocent.
Yep.
But how was his punishment different from what Nixon got?
Hicks got a way lighter sentence than Nixon.
Really?
Yeah, for what he did in Los Angeles, he was sentenced to 5 years to life.
Okay.
And for the Chicago murder, he took a plea deal, pleaded guilty, and got 14 years.
That's a big difference, especially since Nixon got the death penalty.
It is.
It makes you wonder if race and social status played a part in how their cases turned out.
It's hard to know for sure, but it's definitely something to think about.
Sure.
The fact that their sentences were so different brings up some big questions about fairness and equality in the justice system.
Absolutely. It shows that justice isn't always fair and that those biases we talked about can really affect people's lives, especially when it comes to race and class.
You're right.
Now, you said before that there was a connection between Robert Nixon's story and a famous book.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so it's Richard Wright's really important novel, Native Son.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
Wright was living in Chicago while that whole Moron case was happening, and it really affected him.
What was it about the case that really stuck with him?
In his essay, How Bigger Was Born, Wright explained that the Robert Nixon case was like the main inspiration for Native Son.
Interesting.
He saw in Nixon a reflection of all the struggles that young black men in America were facing back then, things like poverty, no opportunities, and always being afraid of being falsely accused and punished unfairly by a system that was against them.
So it wasn't just inspired by the crimes themselves, but by the bigger picture of how this case showed the racial injustices of that time.
You got it. Wright used the Nixon case as a way to explore these big ideas of racial inequality prejudice and how black people were treated as less than human in America.
Wow.
He even said that some of the things that happened in Native Son are fictional versions of real events from the Robert Nixon case.
That's amazing. It's so cool to see how a real-life case like this could inspire such a powerful book.
I know, right?
A book that people are still reading and talking about today.
And that just shows how powerful art can be.
Yeah.
It can show us what's wrong with society, make us face hard truths, and inspire us to fight for justice and equality.
It's like we've uncovered a bunch of mysteries at once.
Yeah,
These brutal murders, all the racial tension, and then this amazing book being written.
it's all connected.
But before we finish up, I want to go back to Robert Nixon himself.
Okay.
What happened to him in the end?
Well, Robert Nixon was convicted of murdering Florence Castle, and he was sentenced to death.
Oh, wow.
On June 16, 1939, he was executed in the electric chair at the Cook County Jail. He was only 19 years old.
That's so tragic.
It is.
A sad ending for a story that's already so full of sadness.
Yeah.
And even though Nixon is gone, the questions his case raises about racial injustice, media bias, and the problems with our justice system are just as important today as they were back then.
They are.
It's like his story is a warning from the past that we haven't really listened to.
I agree.
It's like we've been peeling back all these layers of some kind of historical onion, right?
Yeah.
We started with these horrible murders and then found all this media frenzy and racial tension from back then. And then we saw how this whole thing inspired this incredible book that people are still talking about today.
Right.
It's crazy how connected it all is.
It really is. And that's what makes cases like this so fascinating and still important today.
Yeah.
They're not just about the crimes themselves, but about all the things going on in society that shape those crimes and how we see them.
Right.
The Robert Nixon case is like a mini version of so many bigger problems that are still happening today.
So if we zoom out from the details of this case, what are the big things our listeners should take away from this?
Okay.
Why should they care about this guy, Robert Nixon, who lived and died almost 100 years ago?
I think it's about realizing that the past isn't really over. The problems with racial bias in the justice system, how much power the media has to tell stories, and the fight for equality, those are all still happening today.
So it's like we're all dealing with what happened in cases like Robert Nixon's, even if we don't realize it.
Exactly. And we have a responsibility to learn from these stories, to really think about our own beliefs and biases, and to try to make things more fair and equal.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying that real change has to start with us looking at ourselves and being willing to challenge what we think and believe.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not just about changing ourselves. It's about all of us working together.
Yeah.
We need to hold our institutions accountable, demand that the criminal justice system be more transparent and fair, and support those organizations that are fighting for racial justice and equality.
So it's got to be both personal and systemic change.
Right.
It sounds overwhelming, but I guess the only other option is to just accept things the way they are, and we can't do that, can we?
No, we can't. We can't just sit back and do nothing.
Right.
The Robert Nixon case and so many others show us what happens when we let injustice continue.
That's a good point. Well, this deep dive has definitely been really insightful and thought-provoking, even though it's been a little heavy.
Yeah,
But honestly, I have even more questions now than I did before.
I bet.
Like if Richard Wright saw Robert Nixon's story as a reflection of a messed up system, what can we actually do to fix those systemic problems today?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
There's no easy answer, no quick fix, but I think the first thing is to be aware of the problem.
Okay.
We have to learn about the history of racial injustice in this country, understand how these systems of oppression are still working, and see how we might be part of the problem even if we don't mean to be.
So you're saying that to really change things, we have to start by looking at ourselves and being willing to question our own assumptions and biases.
Exactly. And it's not just about individuals changing, it's about everyone taking action together.
Yeah.
We have to hold our institutions accountable, like I said, demand that the criminal justice system be more transparent and fair, and support those organizations that are fighting for racial justice and equality.
So it's like a multi-pronged approach that needs both personal and systemic change.
Right.
It sounds like a huge challenge, but I guess the alternative is to just accept things as they are, and that's not really an option.
Nope, not at all. We can't afford to be complacent.
Right.
The Robert Nixon case and countless others are stark reminders of what happens when we let injustice go unchecked.
Well said. This has given me a lot to think about. I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
I would just encourage everyone to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a better world.
Yeah.
The fight for justice is a marathon, not a sprint, and it takes all of us working together and staying committed.
I totally agree. Knowledge is power, and by understanding the past, we can hopefully make a better future. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me today. It's been really eye-opening, to say the least.
It's been my pleasure, and to our listeners, keep digging, keep exploring, and never stop fighting for what's right.